Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode, we are going to make my fuel gauge read properly. So, stay tuned. Welcome to the next episode of Classic Mini DIY. So like I said, we are going to be working on my fuel gauge today, and I'm going to be installing something called a fuel gauge wizard. This is something made by a company called Spiyda. It's spelled kind of funny. I'll toss it up on the screen here. I bought this for myself because I've got a bit of an issue between my fuel sender and the fuel gauge that I have in my car. And I would expect a few of you probably have similar issues on your car as well. Now, before we get into this, I want to talk a little bit about what a fuel gauge sender is, and then obviously how that interfaces with your gauge. So there are tons of fuel gauges that have existed over the life of the Classic Mini. Earlier ones would rely on a different kind of resistance and a different kind of voltage than what the later style gauges actually would need. And as a result, the fuel senders, which are the units inside your fuel tank that help determine the level of your fuel, it's the unit that actually tells the gauge where to be on the actual fuel gauge, level indicator. Now, a fuel gauge sender sits inside the fuel tank, and it's the small circular piece that sits right on the side. If you look inside your boot or your trunk, you should see it right on the side of your fuel tank. Now, on the other side of that small circle is a more complicated mechanism, and what it does is it has a small float in it, so we're going to use this rubber mallet as an example. And this rubber mallet, the end that has the rubber on it, is what we would consider the float on the fuel. Now, as the fuel gets lower and lower in level inside your fuel tank, the sender's float will go farther and farther down. This in turn is sending a certain amount of resistance to the fuel gauge, and that's what determines where the needle sits on the gauge. So as the fuel level goes up, it's changing that resistance and telling that gauge to read a different level so you know what amount of fuel is in your petrol tank. So in my setup, I have a very, very early style sending unit. This is a sending unit for a Mark I Mini, and I believe they changed around the 1967 time range, although I don't know that for sure. But basically they have bolts all the way around the sender unit. So if you see bolts on your sending unit, then you know that that is an earlier style sender. Now, there used to be the ability to purchase gauges and fuel gauge indicators that would match up to the sender. But as times have progressed, it's become harder and harder to find one that matches these early style sending units. Now, as a result, you probably get some kind of weird behavior when you mix and match the sending unit with a gauge that's not calibrated for it. And in my case, my behavior is when my tank is full, it's actually sitting at the halfway mark on the fuel gauge. And then when my tank is empty, it actually sits at full. So it's a little bit confusing. It's also not super responsive or reliable. Anything in between full and empty is kind of like a crapshoot. You never really know how much fuel you'll have until you're out of fuel, which is not ideal. Not ideal. As a result, I've actually run out of fuel quite a few times on the road simply because I wasn't paying attention to that gauge, nor was I kind of in tune with the weirdness of it. Now that is where this new computerized fancy little unit comes from, and get a little bit closer here, you can see that there isn't much to this. I'm going to pull this harness off, and basically there are 4 buttons inside this unit, and then you have your leads on the other side. And the way that this works is these wires, which I'll show you in a little bit, are wired specifically to your sender, to a 12-volt signal, and your gauge. And this is going to do the job of normalizing and properly sending the fuel gauge level to your gauge. It's really cool. Now, this isn't a sponsored video or anything. I bought this for myself, but if you guys are interested in picking up one of these, there is a link in my description. It's not an affiliate link or anything, so if you want it, head on over there, check them out. I'm really excited about installing this because I have never had a properly functioning fuel gauge level. Now, these come with a few pre-programmed settings on them. I did not see one for the Classic Mini, So what that means is we're going to have to also calibrate this ourselves. It's a really simple process, but it does involve a little bit of time, because what you're doing is telling this is what it's reading at empty, this is what it reads at a quarter tank, half a tank, 3/4 of a tank, and full. Then, once you have those set and programmed in here, this can do the job of interpreting all the in-between states and sending the correct resistance to your gauge. So first thing we need to do is get out to the car and wire this up, and we're gonna kind of, we're gonna use some existing wiring back there, and then we're also gonna have to introduce a little bit new wiring. So let's head out to the car and we'll get started. All right, so this is where we're gonna get started. Now, you can see I've got my Mark I fuel tank in here, and if you've been following the supercharged build, you might remember that I did have an SPI tank in here for a little bit, which meant my fuel gauge was reading correctly. Unfortunately, I had to go back to this, this normal tank back here because I couldn't quite get the fuel pressure correct for the Weber carburetor. I couldn't depressurize it enough. So I'll talk more about that in my supercharged videos, but just wanted to comment on that because I'm sure some of you with a keen eye would probably find that and point it out. Now we're going to be grabbing a few of the existing electrical items that are back here. One of those is the sending unit wires, and then the other is our fuel pump wiring. Now, the sending unit wires right now are, one is frayed, that is our ground, and then this green one should be our power lead coming from the gauge itself. And then down underneath the car, we have our fuel pump wires. What I'm going to be doing here is adding an additional power lead here because we do need a switched 12-volt signal. This is going to need to be a full 12-volt signal, no voltage stabilizer, no funny business. It just needs to be a standard 12-volt switched power. So I set these up to be easily unplugged and plugged back in. I'm going to add a special split here for the wiring so we can power both the fuel pump as well as the special unit here, which I'll probably stick on the actual unit here somewhere, hide the wires up, do something fun. Now before we get too deep into this, let's get a test light out or a multimeter, and I want to verify that the power lead from the gauge is this green one right here. And then I also want to verify the hot and ground leads here. If you haven't done this already, in my case, I already have these pre-wired. I already know which ones are the power and which ones are the grounding lines. But a general rule of thumb is that the white wires inside your car, most of the wiring harnesses for the Classic Mini use white as a switched power lead. Green is usually, or some combination of green and a color is usually something that is like an accessory, something like that. And then black is normally ground. You should always, 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 always test these because you can never trust the previous owner. You always need to assume that they've done some sort of funky business with the wiring. So let's get our multimeter and we'll test these out real quick. Now, if you guys are looking for a really nice multimeter, this one right here is made by a company called PT. I got it from an Advanced Auto Parts or something nearby me, but I've been so happy with this. Spending a little bit of extra money and getting a really nice multimeter has been a godsend when it comes to testing wiring throughout the car. Cannot recommend it enough. So we've got our grounding lead, and I'm just going to grab a chassis bolt somewhere here. This should work just fine. And then what we're going to do is go switch the actual ignition on. That'll engage all of the accessory items, and then we're going to test these lines. All right, accessory is on, and first thing we're going to test is the sending unit, which has about 9 volts of power coming from it. What that means is that the gauge up at the front is running through a voltage stabilizer, and it runs it down to about 9.7 to 10 volts. This is totally normal if you have a voltage stabilizer unit in your car. So we'll set that aside, and then we'll take the leads coming from the front, and we're getting a nice solid 13 volts from our fuel pump line. So this is what we're going to take off for the split that is going to run to our new gauge wizard, and then this one is our sending unit, which will splice into that gauge wizard as well. Now, one thing that I want to stress is making sure that you're thinking about yourself in the future. No matter what job you're doing on your car, there is what you could consider the right way or the wrong way to do it, but you can also kind of consider it the way that takes a little bit more time now, but saves you a bunch of headache in the future. Now, you might have noticed the wiring that I already have inside the car is set up so I can plug it and unplug it anytime I want to. And that is because you never know when you're going to have to remove your pump, for example. Your fuel pump maybe goes bad. Or perhaps you want to remove your sending unit, something like that. You always want to make it as easy as possible to service this in the future. And also you want your fixes and changes to last a long time. Now in my case, I've got a hot line that has a female connection on it, and then my grounding line has the male connection. This is so I never plug them in incorrectly, but also it allows me to add in connections like this one. And in my case, now what we're going to have is a single line for our, just like that, and like this. And now we have an additional lead to plug into our gauge wizard that can be wired in a way that is going to allow me to service this in the future. And then of course we have our standard ground, and we're going to probably do the exact same thing here so that I can ground both the gauge wizard as well as the fuel pump that runs down underneath my car. So step one complete. We're going to make another one of these splits for the ground, and then we're also going to start thinking about the connections on the actual sending unit. Now the gauge wizard wiring is not too complicated. The black is your ground. The red is your 12-volt feed. This is your standard signal feed that we're going to be splicing into the fuel pump. Then we have our green, which is going to go to our sending unit. That's going to connect up to the sending unit itself. And then the blue is what's running up to the gauge. So the way you can think about this is the black lead right here is going to get connected to our sending unit like normal. What we're going to be doing is putting the gauge wizard in between this green line and the sender. The green line being what's going up to the gauge, and then the gauge wizard is actually what's going to connect up to our actual sender for the positive, quote, positive lead. So first thing I want to do is get our power connections for our standard normal connections, red and black, connected up and out of the way. All right, and there we have it, red and black connected up, ready to go. Now, next up is our blue connection, which is going to go to our sender. This is where it might be a little confusing because you're going to be connecting this blue wire to the green wire here. So gauge, blue, going to gauge, green here. So the last thing that we're going to do is create a circular connection on the end of this green line so that it can be connected up to our sender. Now, all of our connections are ready. You'll notice that there is a white and an orange lead. In this setup, we're not going to be using these. This is one of them is for the lamp. The orange is for a lamp. I'm not quite sure what that means. And the auxiliary line is, I think, for additional connections and features in the future. I can't imagine that we're going to be changing this very much, so those two are just going to be unused. If you want to, you can actually remove the leads out of this connection. I'm going to leave them in there just in case I need them in the future. What I am going to do, though, is wrap them up with a little bit of tape so they're out of the way and they're not going to bump into anything. All right, and with all those connections ready, let's go ahead and attach everything up so we have it in place and ready to roll. All right, so let's take our gauge wizard, and we're going to go ahead and connect the harness up to this now. And we're going to want to be able to access the buttons that are on the inside of the gauge wizard in order to do this next step. Also, the best thing to do at this point is to make sure that your fuel tank is empty and that you have enough fuel to get it back up to full. So the easiest way I have found to empty your tank if you're going to be doing something like this is to run the fuel pump with the feed line going up to your carburetor, disconnected and going into a bucket or a suitable fuel container. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, empty it out. I'm going to skip ahead because that's not very interesting, and then we'll come back here and get it all run up and configured. All right, so this next part is the part that's kind of confusing, and I'm going to try and explain this in a way that makes it easier for those of us who have minis specifically. Now, our senders, I believe, are a linear type sender based on resistance. Now, there are different kinds of senders. Some of them run off of a temperature, some of them run off of resistance like ours. So normally what you'd have to do is go through each specific setting of the full range of the sender. So empty, quarter full, half full, 3/4 full, and full. So there'd be 5 different settings that you'd have to set across the whole range of your sender. Because ours is a resistance style, I think what we're going to be able to do is use the shortcut. So all we have to do is set the empty and the full settings, and then there's a button in here that allows us to set the intermediate values. So first up, what we're going to do is plug this in, turn on the power. My fuel tank is currently empty, and what we're going to do is set the empty value, and that's done by holding the A button, which is the button right up here on the top side button there when looking at the circuit board as such. And we're going to hold that until the LED inside this little chip here, which you'll see in a minute, flashes 1 time. After we do that, we're going to fill up the tank all the way, and we're going to hold the button until it flashes 5 times, which is the full setting. Once we have those 2 set, we'll be able to set the intermediate values using a 1-button press, which I'll show you here as well. Now, one thing I did just do is disconnect our fuel pump. I don't want that running and cooking the pump when it's empty. So that is off. All we'll have is our sender actually sending the power right now. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and calibrate this for an empty tank. And all you have to do is tap this button once. And you see that little light there? That is what's indicating it's just saved the setting for empty. Now, we're gonna go ahead and fill the tank up, and then we're gonna set it to full. And then we'll have another setting to go ahead and configure the intermediate values. All right, and now with the tank full, we're gonna press and hold this button until it flashes 5 times. And once the light flashes 5 times, we're gonna release, and then it will save the setting for full. 3, 4, 5, saved. And just like that, we have our full and our empty set on the sender. Now all we have to do is set the intermediate values. Now to do that, the procedure is largely the same, except we're going to be hitting the B button, which is the second button from the top, right underneath that A button. We're going to hold it for 2 times, and then it's going to set the intermediate values automatically. So 1, 2, 1, 2, saved. So there we go. Now we have our intermediate values set on the gauge, and we're going to see if that works. If it doesn't work, then you'll have to go back through and set each individual section of those intermediate values. So that's again your quarter full, half full, and 3/4 full. You'll have to set those each manually. Okay, so this next part is where we are actually setting the gauge positions. This is what can be a little bit confusing for some folks. And I was one of those folks that found it a little bit confusing. So the way that this works, we're going to be using all 4 buttons in this setup, and we're going to want to set the empty position first. So we've already got it on empty, so we're going to select the D button. And then since we've already got it at empty, we're going to go ahead and program the setting in right now. And that's done by hitting the C button. Saved. Now we want to set the quarter position. So we're going to hit the D button so it flashes 2 times. 1, 2. And now we're going to use the A and B buttons here. We're going to have to hold them. And this is what's going to sweep the gauge. And we're going to set each individual setting the same way that we might have to with the sensor positions. We are now going to try and set the quarter positions. So it's pretty easy. I'm going to hold one of these buttons and I'm going to show you the gauge sweeping so you can see what it looks like. You can see our gauge starting to sweep, and it might sweep a little slowly here in the mini, but you can see it's moving all the way back up and past up into the full area. So we're going to let that finish, and we're going to move it back to a quarter full, right? We're getting pretty close there. I'm going to pause for a second just to make sure that it has a chance to adjust, and I want to make sure that it's actually at the quarter position before I commit this to memory with the C button. Now with that done, there's only two things left to mention. One is that this does not need constant power in order for it to remember those settings. So you can save things to this and unplug it and it still maintains those settings. One thing I do want to mention is if you go through and set each intermediate value by itself, it's a good idea to get a multimeter and read the resistance across these two posts here. And what that'll do is it'll allow you in the future to set it more easily in the event that you change senders or change something like that. It'll already have those settings pre-configured. In my case, setting a full and an empty and then auto setting those intermediate values is pretty easy, so I'm just gonna stick with that. But again, you don't have to keep power to this all the time in order for it to save the settings. So the last thing that we'll do is we'll put the cover on the back of this unit here, and then I'm gonna get some double-sided tape and stick it right up there on the actual fuel tank so it's kind of out of the way, and then we'll clean up all the wiring underneath. So let's go ahead and do that in 3, 2, 1. Ah, yes, that's much better. It's not, there's still a few kind of colorful plugs back here, but I think that'll be okay. Everything's up out of the way and covered and not gonna ground itself on anything, so now got a fuel tank that's ready to roll. All right, and so the last thing that you're gonna wanna do is just verify that your gauge is fully sweeping now. You can do that by emptying the tank again if you'd like to. In my case, I'm just gonna run the car, make sure that it runs down to empty when I run out of fuel. And if it does, and I see a full sweep as it's going through the whole fuel gambit there, I should be in good shape. If not, then I'll have to go back through and recalibrate it individually at each specific full and empty and all the intermediate steps. Hopefully we won't have to do that with the special intermediate automatic setting function that it has. This was a more technical episode, so if you guys have any questions about how this works, if your fuel gauge and fuel sender is going to work together, which this Gauge Wizard does advertise as it working for any combination of gauge and sender, so you should be in good shape, but feel free to post any questions you have in the comment section below. Now, I really appreciate you joining in today, and until I see you guys again on the next episode, you know the drill. Enjoy those minis, and motor on.